The man writing it said he remembered everything: the bomber, the damage, the wounded crew, the choice. His name was Franz Stigler. When they finally spoke, it was as if no time had passed. They talked for hours. They compared memories. Every detail matched. The altitude, the location, the condition of the bomber. It was real. The two former enemies met in person not long after. They shook hands. Then they hugged, not as soldiers, not as pilots, but as men who had shared a moment that didn't fit into the rules of war. They became close friends. They spent years speaking together at events, telling the story as a lesson, not about victory or defeat, but about humanity, about the idea that even in the worst moments, a single choice can change everything. Charlie Brown often said that Franz didn't just save his life. He saved the lives of 10 men that day, 10 families, generations that came after. Franz Stigler always said the same thing when people called him a hero: "I only did what was right." They stayed friends until the end of their lives. Charlie Brown passed away in 2008. Franz Stigler followed a few months later. Two former enemies, linked forever by a decision made in silence, high above a country at war. And the strange thing is, when you think about World War II with all its violence and destruction, this moment stands out not because of what happened, but because of what didn't. No gunfire, no explosion, just a pause, a look, a choice. And for a few seconds, in a sky filled with death, the war stopped breathing, and everything went quiet, as if the world itself was waiting to see what would happen next. That silence stayed with Charlie Brown long after the engines were shut down and the wheels finally touched English soil. When the bomber rolled to a stop, ground crews ran toward it, shocked that it had even made it back. The aircraft looked like it had been dragged through fire and metal. Holes everywhere, shredded wings, a tail section that should not have existed anymore. Medics pulled wounded crew members out, one by one. Some of them were shaking uncontrollably, not just from the cold, but from the delayed realization that they were alive. Charlie Brown climbed down last. His legs almost gave out when he hit the ground. People congratulated him. Officers clapped him on the shoulder. Someone said, "You're lucky to be alive, son." But Charlie wasn't listening. His mind was still in the sky, locked on that moment when the German fighter pulled alongside them and didn't fire. That night, while others slept or drank to calm their nerves, Charlie lay awake. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the German pilot's face. Calm, focused, human, not a monster, not the enemy he had been trained to imagine, just a man. The war moved on quickly. There were more missions, more losses, more names crossed off lists. Survival demanded emotional numbness. You couldn't think too much. You couldn't ask too many questions. So Charlie buried the memory, pushing it deep inside, where it stayed for decades. On the other side of the war, Franz Stigler returned to his base that day knowing something had changed. He had escorted an enemy aircraft. That alone could have meant a court-martial. Or worse, where he landed. Fellow pilots asked him about the mission. They wanted to know how many kills he got. Franz said very little. He avoided details. He knew better than to talk. In Nazi Germany, mercy was not something you advertised. That night, Franz also didn't sleep. He kept replaying the moment, the broken bomber, the wounded men, the American pilot staring back at him, waiting to die. Franz asked himself the same question over and over again. What kind of man do I want to be when this war ends? As the years passed, Franz flew more missions. He was shot down later in the war and survived. Germany collapsed. Cities burned. The regime fell. And when it was all over, Franz walked away from a uniform, carrying memories he rarely spoke about. He emigrated to Canada, built a new life, raised a family, ran a business. To his neighbors, he was just another immigrant with a European accent and a quiet demeanor. They didn't know he had once stared into the cockpit of an enemy bomber and chosen mercy over duty. For a long time, Franz believed he would never know what happened to that American crew. War swallowed stories like that. No records, no medals, no official acknowledgement, just silence. Meanwhile, Charlie Brown returned to civilian life in the United States. He married. He worked. He tried to live normally. But some nights, usually when the world was quiet, his mind went back to that flight. He wondered if the German pilot had survived the war. He wondered if anyone else would ever believe the story. For years, he kept it to himself. When people talk about the enemy, about how evil they were, Charlie stayed quiet. He knew better. He had seen a different truth, but he didn't know how to explain it without sounding naive or unbelievable. It wasn't until the late 1980s that something changed. Charlie was older now, gray-haired, retired. He attended veteran reunions and events, listening to stories that were slowly fading as men who lived them grew fewer every year. And he realized something that unsettled him deeply. If he didn't tell this story, it would die with him. So he began speaking. At first, people were skeptical. A German fighter pilot escorting a U.S. bomber to safety in the middle of World War II? It sounded impossible. Some thought it was exaggerated. Others thought it was wishful thinking. But Charlie didn't embellish. He didn't dramatize. He just told it exactly as it happened. Eventually, he did something even bolder. He publicly asked for the German pilot to come forward. He said he wanted to thank him. Years passed again. Silence. Then one day, a letter arrived. Franz Stigler had been attending a reunion of former Luftwaffe pilots when he heard someone mention the story. An American bomber. A pilot named Charlie Brown. December 1943. Bremen. Franz froze. He knew immediately. He went home and wrote the letter with shaking hands. He described the damaged bomber, the silent tail gun, the wounded crew, the escort to the North Sea, the salute. When Charlie read it, he knew too. This wasn't coincidence. This was a man. When they finally spoke on the phone, both men became quiet at the same time. There was no anger, no bitterness, just recognition, like finding a missing piece of yourself after 40 years. When they met in person for the first time, witnesses said it was emotional in a way words couldn't capture. Two old men, one separated by ideology and war, now standing face to face, knowing that one decision had tied their lives together forever. They talked about everything. They talked about fear, about responsibility, about how close death had been. Franz explained that his commander's words about honor had echoed in his mind at that exact moment. Charlie explained how he had fully accepted death before the German fighter appeared. They realized something powerful. Both of them had been changed by that moment, even though they had lived on opposite sides of the world afterward. From that point on, they were inseparable. They spoke together in schools, military academies, veteran halls. They didn't glorify them. They didn't sanitize it either. They talked about choices, about how even in systems designed to remove humanity, individuals still had agency. Audiences often asked Franz the same question. Weren't you afraid? Franz would pause before answering. Yes, he'd say. Very afraid. But I was more afraid of becoming someone I couldn't live with. Charlie often added something quietly after that. That man didn't just save our lives.
Look out! The hole's breached!
Who we became.
I see it! Everyone brace for impact!
Friendship lasted. They called each other brothers. When Charlie Brown passed away in 2008, Franz was devastated. He said he had lost a part of himself. When Franz died later that same year, those who knew the story said it felt like the final chapter closing. But maybe it didn't, because every time the story is told, that moment in the sky happens again. The damaged bomber, the silent gun, the German fighter pulling alongside, the pause that shouldn't exist anymore. A moment where orders
Bandit, 11 o'clock high. I'm engaging. Roger, spanking right. I've got the shot. Fire right now. Break left after impact.
And decides that killing is not the only option. And maybe that's why this story refuses to disappear. Because it reminds us that even in the darkest chapters of history, there were seconds where everything could have gone one way. It didn't. The strange thing is, if Franz Stigler had fired his guns that day, no history book would have mentioned it. It would have been another statistic, another bomber lost, another crew gone. No footnote, no mystery. But because he didn't, here we are, still talking about it, still wondering how many other moments like this would have lost to silence, still asking ourselves what we would have done if we were in that cockpit, staring at an enemy who couldn't fight back, with the weight of duty on one side and conscience on the other. And as that question hangs in the air unanswered, The story slows down again, drifting back to that frozen sky, where engines roared, men held their breath, and for a brief moment, the war waited. That question, what would you have done, never really left the people who heard this story. It followed
Eagle 1 to Wingman 2, holding formation, Angels 20. Copy, Eagle 1, solid copy. Initiating climb to Angels 25.
Because this was a story about bravery in the way movies show it. There was no cheering crowd, no dramatic music, no medals pinned in front of cameras. There was only a decision made alone, with no witnesses, no reward, and serious risk. And that's what made it uncomfortable. War teaches people to simplify, friend or enemy, us or them. Good side, bad side. It becomes easier that way. Necessary, even. But Franz Stigler's choice shattered that simplicity. It forced anyone who heard it to admit something most wars try to hide, that the enemy is still human. When Franz and Charlie traveled together speaking about the incident, they noticed something interesting. Veterans reacted differently than civilians. Younger audiences listened in shock, but veterans often sat quietly, eyes lowered, nodding slowly. Some of them approached afterward and said, "I saw something like that once," or "I made a choice I still think about." Those conversations never made headlines. They happened in hallways, parking lots, quiet corners of auditoriums, moments where men admitted that war was not just about courage or fear, but about moral injury, about the things that stay with you not because you did them, but because you almost did. Franz once explained that shooting down the bomber would have been easier, simpler. It would have required no thought, no reflection, just muscle memory and training. Pull the trigger, report the kill, move on. Not shooting required him to stop, to see, to recognize something fragile in the middle of chaos. He later said that in that instant, he didn't see Americans or enemies. He saw young men far from home, scared and broken, exactly like the German pilots he had watched die earlier in the war. The uniforms were different. The fear was the same. Charlie Brown, on the other hand, carried a different burden. He lived knowing that his survival was not earned through skill or strength, but granted through mercy. That realization humbled him for the rest of his life. Whenever someone praised his flying that day, he quietly redirected the credit. "I lived because someone else chose not to kill me," he would say. That sentence alone unsettled people, because it suggested that survival is not always about being the strongest or the smartest. Sometimes it comes down to crossing paths with someone who refuses to let the worst version of the world win. As time passed, historians began to look more closely at stories like this. Not because they were common, they weren't, but because they revealed cracks in the narrative of total war. Small moments where individuals acted outside the machinery of destruction. But these stories were hard to verify. War records rarely documented mercy. Official reports didn't leave space for hesitation or compassion. If Franz had fired, there would have been paperwork. If he didn't, there was nothing to file. Silence was a default. That's why this story almost disappeared. It survived only because both men lived long enough and cared deeply enough to tell it. And even then, it could have vanished if Charlie Brown had never spoken up, if Franz Stigler had never heard about the search, if either of them had decided it was easier to let the past stay buried. History often turns on moments like that, not the famous ones, not the battles everyone knows, but the quiet choices that never expected to be remembered. There's another detail people often miss. Franz didn't just refuse to shoot. He actively protected the bomber. By flying alongside it, he risked being seen by other German pilots. He risked being reported. He risked anti-aircraft fire, mistaking his intentions. If someone on the ground had questioned his actions, he might not have survived the explanation. Yet he stayed. That part of the story rarely gets emphasized, but it matters because it shows that mercy wasn't passive. It wasn't just restraint. It was action, and action always carries consequences. Charlie later admitted that during the escort, he expected betrayal at any moment. War had taught him to distrust mercy. He watched the German fighter constantly, waiting for the guns to suddenly open fire. His hands never left controls. Trust, in that moment, was impossible. Only survival mattered. When Franz finally peeled away and saluted, Charlie didn't salute back. He was afraid that any movement might provoke a final attack. He simply watched, burned the image into his memory, and flew on. That image followed him for the rest of his life. The lone fighter turning away, the war resuming, life continuing. Decades later, when the two men stood together on stage, people often asked them if they thought fate was involved. If something bigger had guided that moment, Charlie would usually shrug. "I don't know about fate," he'd say. "I just know one man chose not to press a button." Franz, standing beside him, would add quietly, "And another man lived long enough to ask why." That exchange said more than any speech. As the years went on, their story began appearing in books, documentaries, and lectures. But even then, it remained strangely fragile. It didn't fit neatly into hero narratives or villain arcs. There was no clear lesson that could be packaged and sold. And maybe that's why it mattered, because it resisted simplification. It forced people to sit with discomfort, with the idea that good and evil are not uniforms you put on or take off, but decisions you make when no one is watching. In classrooms, students debated it endlessly. Should Franz have followed orders? Was mercy a betrayal of his comrades? Was Charlie wrong to accept help from the enemy? Could either of them have acted differently? There were no easy answers, and Franz never offered one. He never said, "Do this." He only said, "This is what I did." And sometimes that's far more powerful, because it leaves the responsibility where it belongs. With us, with anyone who hears a story and imagines themselves in that cockpit, hand hovering over a trigger, heart racing, world collapsing into a single choice. And as that imagination takes hold, as the noise of engines fades again, the story slows down once more, hovering in that thin air between life and death, between obedience and conscience, waiting patiently for the next person to decide how it should continue. What often gets overlooked is how lonely that kind of decision is. Franz Stigler didn't have time to consult anyone. There was no committee, no moral handbook floating beside the cockpit. The war didn't pause to ask him how he felt. The engine was loud. The sky was crowded. Fuel was burning. And yet, in that chaos, the moment narrowed down to something painfully quiet and personal. One man, one trigger, one outcome. Later in life, Franz tried to explain this to people who asked how he knew what to do. He said he didn't know. He just felt a line inside himself, one that, if crossed, could never be uncrossed. That line had nothing to do with nationality. It had to do with identity. Who he would be when the war was over. Who he would have to live with when there were no more enemies to fight. That idea confused a lot of people. Wars are usually explained in terms of duty, orders, survival, winning, losing. But Franz's story introduced something uncomfortable into the conversation. Responsibility that exists even when no one is watching. Responsibility that doesn't disappear just because a uniform tells you what's allowed. Charlie Brown felt that responsibility too, but in a different way. After the war, he struggled with a strange kind of guilt, not survivor's guilt in the usual sense, but something quieter. He knew men who had flown similar missions and never came back. He knew families who never got closure, and he knew that the only reason his story ended differently was because of a decision he didn't control. That realization changed how he looked at people. When Charlie heard political speeches or angry arguments that painted entire groups as evil, he flinched. He couldn't accept it anymore. Not after looking directly into the eyes of someone he had been taught to hate, and realizing that hate didn't tell the full story. He didn't become naive. He didn't forget the war. He understood exactly how brutal it was. But his understanding grew more layered, more complicated. And complexity, he learned, is something people often resist. Simple stories are easier. Good guys versus bad guys. Heroes versus monsters. This story didn't fit. That's why, even when it started gaining attention, it remained strangely fragile. It depended entirely on memory, honesty, and the willingness of people to believe that something good could exist in the middle of something so destructive. Historians debated it. Psychologists analyzed it. Ethicists used it as a case study. But no analysis ever fully captured what it felt like to be there. To feel your stomach drop as a fighter pulls alongside your crippled plane. To brace for death, and then realize it's not coming. That kind of experience doesn't translate neatly into words. It lives in pauses, in the way Franz hesitated before answering certain questions, in the way Charlie sometimes stared off before continuing a sentence. Those silences carried more weight than the speeches. As the years passed, their story began to reach younger generations, people born long after the war had ended, teenagers who had never heard a plane engine in combat, students whose understanding of war came from screens and textbooks. They listened, fascinated, but also unsettled. Some asked, "Would this happen today?" Neither Franz nor Charlie answered directly, because they didn't know, and because the answer depended less on technology or politics, and more on people, on individuals, on whether someone, somewhere, would still recognize that line inside themselves. One teacher once asked Franz if he thought compassion was a form of courage. Franz thought for a long time before replying. "I think courage is doing what lets you sleep at night," he finally said. That answer stayed with people, because it reframed courage not as fearlessness, but as accountability, as the willingness to carry the weight of your choices, long after the moment has passed. Charlie, standing beside him, nodded. He understood that weight, too. He carried it every time he thought about the lives that continued because one had been spared. Children born, families formed, ordinary days lived, all branching outward from a decision made in seconds. That realization was overwhelming at times. It made the world feel fragile and precious. When Charlie spoke to audiences alone without Franz, he often ended up talking less about the war and more about everyday life, about how easy it is to dehumanize people when you don't know them, about how dangerous certainty can be, about how the most important moments in life rarely announce themselves. They don't feel big at the time, he would say. They just feel like choices. That idea resonated deeply, because everyone has choices, not on the scale of war, perhaps, but in quieter, more personal ways. Moments where you can harm or help, ignore or intervene, follow a rule or follow your conscience. The story lingered because it wasn't really about World War II. It was about that space between impulse and action, that split second where something human can still surface. Even now, when people hear the story for the first time, there's often a moment where they lean back and exhale, not because the tension is gone, but because something inside them has been touched, something that recognizes the weight of that choice, even across decades. And the strangest part is, the war itself keeps receding into the past. The uniforms fade. The technology becomes outdated. The names disappear from living memory. But that moment in the sky doesn't age. It stays suspended. A damaged bomber. A silent fighter. Two men who never should have met, meeting anyway, and somewhere in that thin, freezing air, the world holding its breath, waiting to see whether the trigger will be pulled, or whether, just as once, it would remain untouched. As time stretched on, something subtle began to happen to the story itself. It stopped belonging only to Franz Stigler and Charlie Brown. It began to live in the spaces between people, in conversations, classrooms, late-night reflections, and quiet arguments about right and wrong. Each retelling added a new layer, not by changing the facts, but by changing the listener, because everyone who heard it brought their own questions. Parents wondered how they would want their children to act in a moment like that. Soldiers wondered whether they had crossed lines they never spoke about. Teachers wondered how to explain morality without turning it into a checklist. And ordinary people, those far removed from war, wondered whether they would even recognize such a moment if it appeared in their own lives. That's what made the story unsettling. It didn't stay in the past. It followed people home. For Franz, the later years of his life became unexpectedly heavy, not because he regretted what he had done, but because of how people reacted to it. Some praised him endlessly. Some called him a hero. Others questioned him. A few even accused him of betrayal. They argued that mercy in war weakens discipline, that exceptions create cracks, that survival depends on obedience. Franz listened to all of it quietly. He rarely defended himself. He understood something most people didn't. That once a decision is made, arguing about it doesn't change its weight. You still carry it. Praise doesn't lighten it. Criticism doesn't erase it. He once said to a close friend that the hardest part wasn't the moment in the sky. It was realizing that people wanted his choice to be a rule, a formula, something repeatable. But he knew it wasn't. It was situational, human, fragile. Charlie Brown faced a different kind of reaction. People often treated him as if he were lucky, as if his survival were a miracle detached from intention. That never sat right with him. He insisted on emphasizing the agency behind it. The fact that someone had chosen not to kill. Luck implies randomness. This wasn't random. It was deliberate. And that distinction mattered to Charlie deeply. He believed that if people reduce a story to chance, they miss the entire point. The point wasn't that he survived. The point was that someone else decided he should. That idea, being spared rather than spared by accident, forced a level of gratitude that was uncomfortable to sit with. It demanded humility. It demanded reflection. It demanded acknowledgement and dependence on others in ways that clashed with the myth of individual strength. Charlie often spoke about how that moment changed the way he judged people. He became slower to assume, slower to condemn, more aware of how little he knew about what others carried. He once admitted that before the war, he thought courage was loud, confident, assertive. After the war, he learned that courage could also be quiet, hesitant, lonely. Sometimes courage looked like doing nothing when everything around you demanded action. As the years passed, their joint appearances became rarer. Age took its toll. Travel became harder. But the bond between them remained strong. They wrote letters. They spoke on the phone. Their conversations were rarely dramatic. They talked about family's health, memories that surfaced without warning. Yet, even in ordinary conversations, the war hovered in the background, not as trauma, but as context, a shared origin point. They didn't need to revisit the story constantly. They both knew it by heart. What mattered was the understanding beneath it. That understanding deepened as they aged. They realized that what had happened between them wasn't just an interruption of violence. It was a form of recognition. Franz recognized Charlie as a human being before recognizing him as an enemy. Charlie recognized Franz as a man before recognizing him as a threat. Recognition is powerful. It changes behavior. It alters outcomes. And it's remarkably rare in moments designed to erase it. Historians later pointed out that this wasn't the only instance of restraint in World War II. There were others, small, isolated, often undocumented, soldiers who looked away, pilots who missed on purpose, guards who slowed their patrols, acts that never made it into official records because they disrupted the narrative of total commitment. But few of those acts were ever confirmed. This one was, because both sides lived long enough to speak, because their memories aligned, because neither man had anything to gain by lying. That alignment mattered. In a world increasingly skeptical of truth, this story stood on an unusual foundation: mutual verification across enemy lines. It became a reminder that truth sometimes survives not because it is loud, but because it is shared. As new generations encountered the story, they interpreted it through their own lenses. Some framed it as a religious lesson, others as a philosophical one. Some saw it as proof that goodness is innate. Others argued it showed how fragile morality becomes under pressure. All of them were partly right. The story refused to be owned by a single interpretation, and that, too, was part of its power. In military academies, instructors use it to spark debates about rules of engagement. Where does lawful action end and moral responsibility begin? Is obedience absolute? Can mercy coexist with discipline? The debates were intense. There were no final answers, just tension. The same tension Franz had felt in the cockpit, the same tension Charlie had felt in the bomber. That unresolved tension was the story's heartbeat. It pulsed quietly beneath every retelling. And perhaps the most unsettling realization came when people recognized that moments like this don't announce themselves. Franz didn't know he was making a historic decision. Charlie didn't know his survival would one day be studied and discussed. They thought they were just trying to get through the day. That realization reframed everything. It suggested that the most important moral decisions in life might come disguised as ordinary seconds. Moments when no one is watching, when there is no applause waiting, when the outcome will likely remain unknown. Moments when silence feels safer than choice. And yet, choice happens anyway. As this understanding settled in, The story began to change people not through inspiration, but through discomfort. It removed excuses. It made it harder to say, "I had no choice." It suggested that even under immense pressure, there's often a sliver of agency left, small but real. Not enough to save the world, but maybe enough to save one life, or one piece of yourself. That's why, when people ask why this story still matters, there is no simple answer. It matters because it challenges the way we simplify history. It matters because it complicates our understanding of duty. It matters because it refuses to let us hide behind systems, uniforms, or orders. It pulls everything back to the individual, to the moment before action, to the pause. And as long as people continue to wrestle with that pause, continue to imagine themselves suspended in that cold sky, weighing obedience against conscience, the story remains unfinished, stretching forward through time, waiting for the next moment, the next person, the next decision that will echo it in a different form. As time stretched on, something subtle began to happen to the story itself. It stopped belonging only to Franz Stigler and Charlie Brown. It began to live in the spaces between people, in conversations, classrooms, late-night reflections, and quiet arguments about right and wrong. Each retelling added a new layer, not by changing the facts, but by changing the listener, because everyone who heard it brought their own questions. Parents wondered how they would want their children to act in a moment like that. Soldiers wondered whether they had crossed lines they never spoke about. Teachers wondered how to explain morality without turning it into a checklist. And ordinary people, those far removed from war, wondered whether they would even recognize such a moment if it appeared in their own lives. That's what made the story unsettling. It didn't stay in the past. It followed people home. For Franz, the later years of his life became unexpectedly heavy, not because he regretted what he had done, but because of how people reacted to it. Some praised him endlessly. Some called him a hero. Others questioned him. A few even accused him of betrayal. They argued that mercy in war weakens discipline, that exceptions create cracks, that survival depends on obedience. Franz listened to all of it quietly. He rarely defended himself. He understood something most people didn't. That once a decision is made, arguing about it doesn't change its weight. You still carry it. Praise doesn't lighten it. Criticism doesn't erase it. He once said to a close friend that the hardest part wasn't the moment in the sky. It was realizing that people wanted his choice to be a rule, a formula, something repeatable. But he knew it wasn't. It was situational, human, fragile. Charlie Brown faced a different kind of reaction. People often treated him as if he were lucky, as if his survival were a miracle detached from intention. That never sat right with him. He insisted on emphasizing the agency behind it. The fact that someone had chosen not to kill. Luck implies randomness. This wasn't random. It was deliberate. And that distinction mattered to Charlie deeply. He believed that if people reduce a story to chance, they miss the entire point. The point wasn't that he survived. The point was that someone else decided he should. That idea, being spared rather than spared by accident, forced a level of gratitude that was uncomfortable to sit with. It demanded humility. It demanded reflection. It demanded acknowledgement and dependence on others in ways that clashed with the myth of individual strength. Charlie often spoke about how that moment changed the way he judged people. He became slower to assume, slower to condemn, more aware of how little he knew about what others carried. He once admitted that before the war, he thought courage was loud, confident, assertive. After the war, he learned that courage could also be quiet, hesitant, lonely. Sometimes courage looked like doing nothing when everything around you demanded action. As the years passed, their joint appearances became rarer. Age took its toll. Travel became harder. But the bond between them remained strong. They wrote letters. They spoke on the phone. Their conversations were rarely dramatic. They talked about family's health, memories that surfaced without warning. Yet, even in ordinary conversations, the war hovered in the background, not as trauma, but as context, a shared origin point. They didn't need to revisit the story constantly. They both knew it by heart. What mattered was the understanding beneath it. That understanding deepened as they aged. They realized that what had happened between them wasn't just an interruption of violence. It was a form of recognition. Franz recognized Charlie as a human being, before recognizing him as an enemy. Charlie recognized Franz as a man before recognizing him as a threat. Recognition is powerful. It changes behavior. It alters outcomes. And it's remarkably rare in moments designed to erase it. Historians later pointed out that this wasn't the only instance of restraint in World War II. There were others, small, isolated, often undocumented. Soldiers who looked away, pilots who missed on purpose, guards who slowed their patrols, acts that never made it into official records because they disrupted the narrative of total commitment. But few of those acts were ever confirmed. This one was, because both sides lived long enough to speak, because their memories aligned, because neither man had anything to gain by lying. That alignment mattered. In a world increasingly skeptical of truth, this story stood on an unusual foundation: mutual verification across enemy lines. It became a reminder that truth sometimes survives not because it is loud, but because it is shared. As new generations encountered the story, they interpreted it through their own lenses. Some framed it as a religious lesson, others as a philosophical one. Some saw it as proof that goodness is innate. Others argued it showed how fragile morality becomes under pressure. All of them were partly right. The story refused to be owned by a single interpretation, and that, too, was part of its power. In military academies, instructors use it to spark debates about rules of engagement. Where does lawful action end and moral responsibility begin? Is obedience absolute? Can mercy coexist with discipline? The debates were intense. There were no final answers, just tension. The same tension Franz had felt in the cockpit, the same tension Charlie had felt in the bomber. That unresolved tension was the story's heartbeat. It pulsed quietly beneath every retelling. And perhaps the most unsettling realization came when people recognized that moments like this don't announce themselves. Franz didn't know he was making a historic decision. Charlie didn't know his survival would one day be studied and discussed. They thought they were just trying to get through the day. That realization reframed everything. It suggested that the most important moral decisions in life might come disguised as ordinary seconds. Moments when no one is watching, when there is no applause waiting, when the outcome will likely remain unknown. Moments when silence feels safer than choice. And yet, choice happens anyway. As this understanding settled in, the story began to change people not through inspiration, but through discomfort. It removed excuses. It made it harder to say, "I had no choice." It suggested that even under immense pressure, there's often a sliver of agency left, small but real. Not enough to save the world, but maybe enough to save one life, or one piece of yourself. That's why, when people ask why this story still matters, there is no simple answer. It matters because it challenges the way we simplify history. It matters because it complicates our understanding of duty. It matters because it refuses to let us hide behind systems, uniforms, or orders. It pulls everything back to the individual, to the moment before action, to the pause. And as long as people continue to wrestle with that pause, continue to imagine themselves suspended in that cold sky, weighing obedience against conscience, the story remains unfinished, stretching forward through time, waiting for the next moment, the next person, the next decision that will echo it in a different form. Even decades later, long after the engines of war had quieted and the world had moved on, the echoes of that cold December morning refused to fade for either man. The story did not remain confined to textbooks or military archives. It had taken on a life of its own, living in conversations, lectures, and the imaginations of those who heard it. What made it remarkable was not only the act itself, but the layers of human complexity it revealed. Layers that historians, soldiers, students, and ordinary people would spend years untangling. Charlie Brown often thought about how fragile life is in war. For him, every single day following that mission was colored by the memory of Franz's decision. He had survived because another man chose mercy, a choice entirely outside his control. This created a quiet, persistent tension in his life. How should one live knowing that survival depended entirely on someone else's conscience? How should one live when one's existence was a gift, not earned through skill or luck alone, but through compassion? The war itself continued to unfold in Charlie's memory in ways textbooks could never capture. He remembered the way the sky looked that day, The gray clouds, heavy and low, drifting across the German countryside like silent witnesses. He remembered the bursts of anti-aircraft fire, flak shells exploding around the formation in terrifying puffs of black smoke. He remembered the faces of his fellow crew members, frozen with fear and shock, hands gripping the sides of their seats as the plane shook violently. Every one of them believed death was imminent, and yet, for those minutes, they weren't the only ones suspended between life and death. Franz Stigler, high above in his cockpit, was experiencing his own suspended reality, a moral crucible that would define the rest of his life. Franz remembered his father's words, which had echoed in his mind as he approached the bomber. "Fight with honor, Franz," he had said years before, in an older, quieter Germany. "The war may ask you to kill, but honor is not measured by how many you destroy, but by how you act when destruction is around you." Franz didn't know at the time how profoundly those words would resonate. They guided his hands and his conscience that day in December 1943, as he faced a choice between following orders or following what he believed was right. The bomber continued to shudder and falter, its engines coughing in protest, its fuselage riddled with holes. Charlie felt the plane dip and sway in a way that made his stomach churn. But he also noticed something extraordinary. A German fighter had pulled alongside them. The pilot was steady, poised, calm. No aggression, no attack, just presence. And in that moment, something impossible happened. Charlie, a soldier trained to fear this enemy above all else, felt confusingly safe. He would later describe that sensation as surreal. Imagine the worst enemy imaginable, armed, trained, experienced, and yet offering not death but protection. It was the most confusing, most shocking, most profoundly human experience he had ever encountered. It didn't make sense on paper. It didn't fit into the logic of war. But it happened, and he knew it was real. In the quiet years after the war, Charlie and Franz both reflected on that surreal moment. For Charlie, it became a compass in his moral life. Every time he faced a decision, ethical, professional, personal, he returned mentally to that moment in the sky, to the knowledge that one person's decision could ripple across decades, affecting not just lives in immediate danger, but countless lives down the line. He often imagined that moment as a pivot point, a fulcrum on which everything else balanced. Franz, for his part, carried his own burdens. Though he had survived the war, he knew that if anyone in the Luftwaffe hierarchy had discovered his actions, the consequences could have been fatal. German military culture at the time left little room for mercy toward the enemy. Yet Franz felt no fear in his moral choice. He later explained that the fear he did feel was personal. Fear of what he would become if he allowed the bomber to be destroyed without thought, fear that the war could strip him of his humanity, and fear that he would carry the weight of unnecessary deaths for the rest of his life. The world, as both men realized, often failed to recognize the subtle, courageous acts that happen in the shadows of history. Charlie tried to preserve the memory for decades, writing letters, quietly talking to friends, and attempting to connect with the man who had saved him. He knew that if Franz's actions were forgotten, the story and the lesson would be lost. In a war dominated by violence, the rare choice to preserve life was dangerously invisible. When Charlie finally received a response from Franz many years later, he felt a mix of relief and disbelief. The letter was polite, understated, and meticulous, detailing the pilot's recollection of the encounter. Franz remembered the bomber, the holes in its fuselage, the injured crew, and the way Charlie had maneuvered the aircraft in desperation. He also remembered signaling the American pilot, guiding the plane towards safety, risking his own position and life to ensure that the men inside could survive. The detail and honesty stunned Charlie. Every word confirmed the story he had carried alone for decades. When they finally met in person, the reunion was quiet, deeply emotional, and profoundly human. There were no speeches, no dramatic gestures. There was only two men, once enemies, who had been united by a single, extraordinary moment of conscience. They spoke about fear, about responsibility, about choices made under impossible circumstances. They spoke about survival and morality and the invisible lines that define human behavior. They spoke until words failed, until silence took over, until they realized that everything they could say had been said, but the gravity of the story would linger indefinitely. The story itself, however, refused to remain static. Once Charlie and Franz began sharing it publicly, it evolved. It became a moral lens through which people could examine the nature of war, courage, and conscience. Veterans would recall similar, unrecorded acts of mercy, validating the universality of the choice. Civilians would imagine themselves in that cockpit, fingers hovering over triggers, hearts racing, imagining the weight of the decision. Students and historians debated endlessly whether Franz had acted out of morality, instinct, or simple human recognition. No answer was ever definitive. That ambiguity was precisely the point, what made the story resonate, even to those far removed from the battlefield of Europe, was its insistence on human agency in the midst of chaos. War, with its overwhelming machinery, attempts to reduce people to pawns. Orders, regulations, doctrines, all attempt to strip away individuality. Yet Franz's choice reintroduced the human element, demonstrating that even in total war, one person could exercise morality, however fleetingly, however invisibly. Over time, the story became a quiet emblem of hope, a counter-narrative to the brutality of war. It illustrated a principle that is rarely documented but deeply understood, that one individual's choice, even in a sea of destruction, can preserve life, conscience, and dignity. Every lecture, every book, every retelling reinforced this principle. And with each iteration, the story grew longer, not because the facts changed, but because the ripple effect of that single act expanded outward, touching countless lives indirectly. Charlie and Franz remained in contact until the very end of their lives. Their correspondence revealed the ordinary details of human existence: birthdays, grandchildren, health issues, memories of ordinary life, moments of humor. Yet underlying every mundane letter was the extraordinary bond forged by a single decision in the skies over Germany decades earlier. The extraordinary and ordinary coexisted, intertwined, inseparable. The public began to recognize the story not as a historical footnote, but as a moral parable. Documentaries highlighted the decision with careful reenactments, narrations capturing the tension of the sky, the fear, the human connection, and the quiet heroism. Readers marveled not at strategy, weaponry, or tactics, but at the subtle power of conscience. The story refused to be simplified into heroics or nationalism. It was human, messy, complicated, and impossible to ignore. And yet, for all its public recognition, the story remained incomplete. Not because facts were missing, but because its lessons could never be fully captured. It required the imagination of each listener. It demanded reflection, ethical questioning, and an acknowledgement that morality often exists in the moments where action seems impossible, where fear dominates, and where the world offers no applause. The story of Franz and Charlie was extraordinary precisely because it showed how fragile morality can be in war, yet how resilient the human spirit remains when one acts against the tide of expectation. It demonstrated that courage is not always explosive or visible. Sometimes it is quiet, small, private, and terrifying. Sometimes courage is a choice not to destroy when destruction is expected, demanded, and rewarded. Even today, when people retell it, the story expands further. Each retelling adds reflections, insights, and moral questions. Every audience member imagines themselves in the cockpit. Every reader imagines the way of the sky, the shudder of a damaged bomber, the adrenaline coursing to the veins of pilots, and the terrifying freedom of making the ultimate moral choice alone. And the story doesn't end. Because every time someone reads it, thinks about it, or discusses it, the story stretches into new imaginations, new reflections, new generations. Every person who encounters it is invited into the cockpit, invited to weigh duty against conscience, obedience against morality, fear against humanity. And in that invitation, the story continues, growing, spreading, lingering, untethered by time, unconfined by geography, and unending in its impact. The quiet, suspended moment in the sky, that pause in the chaos, exists now in every reflection, every conversation, every classroom debate, every moral dilemma anyone has ever faced. It is infinite because humanity itself keeps reliving it, struggling with it, and asking over and over, what would I have done? And that ultimately is the power of the story. It is not merely history. It is a mirror. It is a question. It is a challenge. It is alive. It waits silently in the minds and hearts of all who hear it, stretching forward indefinitely, demanding that we measure our own choices against the quiet heroism of a German pilot who, for a single, suspended moment in December 1943, chose humanity over duty, mercy over destruction, and conscience over command. Even as the decades passed, the sky that day never left Charlie Brown. He would sit quietly in his home, looking at clouds drifting across the horizon, and remember how the sun broke through briefly, as if acknowledging what had happened. That small sliver of light had fallen on the bomber, highlighting its damaged fuselage, the torn metal edges, the holes where flak had shredded the plane. Every detail was vivid, as if etched permanently into memory. He could still feel the vibration of the engines, the shudder of the aircraft as it lurched under the stress of battle, and the terrifying mix of exhaustion, fear, and hope that pulsed through the entire crew. Franz Stigler, meanwhile, lived with his own version of memory. He would lie awake in his later years, thinking about the bomber, the men inside, and the almost imperceptible pause before he made his choice. That pause was not hesitation. It was something far more profound. It was recognition. Recognition of humanity in a moment designed to strip it away. Recognition that even amidst a war consuming millions of lives, a single person could choose restraint, compassion, and moral courage. He would often recall a precise moment when his fingers hovered over controls, the guns armed, ready to fulfill orders, and then, almost imperceptibly, he had made a choice that would define the rest of his life. The first time they met after decades, in a small conference hall during a veterans reunion, both men were overwhelmed, not by nostalgia, not by heroism, but by the gravity of shared experience. When they shook hands, neither could speak for a long moment. Their eyes met and held, silently acknowledging the weight of decision that had bound them across time, across continents, and across ideology. Franz, then in his late 70s, had tears in his eyes. Charlie, slightly older, grasped his hand firmly, as if afraid that the moment would vanish like smoke if he loosened his grip. They did not need words. Both understood that this encounter was not about the war. It was about the fragile, stubborn persistence of humanity. The press, of course, eventually caught wind of it. Newspapers ran cautious headlines. Enemy pilot saved American crew. The war story you haven't heard. Television networks sought interviews, expecting a sensational tale of wartime heroics. But Charlie and Franz did not oblige. They refused to dramatize it. There were no sweeping gestures, no declarations of glory. They told the story as it had happened. A broken bomber, a damaged crew, and a single fighter pilot who chose not to fire. That honesty, its restraint and subtlety, captivated viewers far more than any exaggerated version of heroism could have. And yet, the story did not rest there. Over time, it grew. With each retelling, layers emerged, both factual and moral. People began asking questions that neither man had anticipated. What if more pilots had made similar choices? How many lives might have been spared? Could moral courage be taught? Could it survive the machinery of war? These were not questions with simple answers. Some scholars argued that Franz had acted in defiance of orders, an anomaly that only underscored the brutality of the system. Others insisted that he had exemplified the potential for human goodness, even in extreme circumstances. Charlie often reflected on these interpretations with a sense of quiet wonder. The moral and ethical implications of that day extended far beyond the cockpit or the bomber. That single choice, made in a fraction of a second, unobserved by most, and without expectation of reward, had set off ripples across time. Families were spared grief. Lives continued. Decisions were shaped by the awareness that mercy, even in war, could exist. Charlie wondered how many other Franz Stiglers had acted similarly, unnoticed, leaving history silent. Franz, too, thought about these questions constantly. He had survived the war physically, but the mental and moral weight of that day had followed him relentlessly. He had seen comrades die, witnessed brutality, and understood the full machinery of a system designed to erase individuality. Yet in the cockpit that day, a fragile line of conscience had cut through all of that. That line, small and human, had prevailed. It reminded him for the rest of his life that morality is not abstract. It exists in action in small but critical moments, and it carries consequences, sometimes seen, sometimes invisible. Their joint talks became a phenomenon. Veterans, historians, students, and ordinary citizens all wanted to understand the story not as history, but as a lesson in human behavior. Charlie and Franz emphasized that it was not heroism in the traditional sense, but decision-making in a morally complex world. They reminded people that the quiet, ethical choices we make, often unobserved and unrecognized, define who we are, and they left audiences with a single, lingering question. What would you have done? Charlie often noted the irony. War was designed to make morality irrelevant. Survival, obedience, and ideology ruled every decision. Yet, in the midst of it, humanity persisted. One man in one brief moment had broken the rules, defied expectation, and preserved life. And in doing so, he had changed not only the fate of Charlie Brown and his crew, but also the way generations would come to see courage, morality, and human potential. The story continued to evolve, growing richer with time. Scholars analyzed every detail of Franz's flight path, the conditions of the bomber, the timing of the escort, and the risk calculations he had faced. Philosophers debated whether this act was purely moral or also practical, whether it could be generalized to other wartime scenarios, or whether its uniqueness was precisely what made it profound. Military ethicists use it as a case study, showing how orders of morality can come into conflict, and how individual judgment plays a critical role even in systems designed to demand compliance. For Charlie, the story became a lifelong meditation on gratitude, survival, and the fragility of life. He spoke frequently about how our understanding of courage is often skewed toward overt action, ignoring the subtle, quiet, and morally difficult decisions that shape who we are. He often said, "We survive not because of bombs or guns, but because someone saw us as human, not targets. That is the most profound form of bravery I have ever known." Franz would nod quietly, agreeing, but rarely adding more. His silence spoke volumes. Words could never fully capture the precise balance of fear, clarity, and moral vision required in that instant. The cockpit was small, the sky vast, and the consequences absolute. Yet he had acted decisively in favor of conscience over orders. As they aged, the story's reach expanded. Books were written. Documentaries were produced. Lectures were given around the world. But its essence remained simple. In the midst of unimaginable violence, a man chose compassion and a life was saved. That was all. Yet that simplicity carried extraordinary weight, because it reminded humanity that even in the darkest times, individuals have agency, and that agency can alter the course of history, one human choice at a time. And still, the story did not end, because every person who reads it, every student who hears it, every soldier who reflects on it, adds their own interpretation. Every moral dilemma, every ethical choice, every moment of hesitation or courage echoes this story. It is infinite, growing with each new mind it touches, expanding across time, space, and generations. It is alive, waiting in every pause, every heartbeat, every silent decision that might determine life, death, or the integrity of one's soul. The story is still here, in every conversation about conscience, in every debate over morality and obedience, in every reflection on what it means to act humanely in the midst of chaos. And it will remain endlessly unfolding, because the moment in the sky, the bomber, the fighter, the pause, the choice, continues to resonate. It asks us all in every era, across every circumstance, what would you do if faced with the same impossible choice? As the decades unfolded, Charlie Brown and Franz Stigler both came to realize something profound. The story that day was never truly about war. It was about humanity. It was about the fragile, persistent light of conscience that survives even amidst total chaos. War had tried to define them, define courage, obedience, victory, and loss, but the moment in the sky transcended all of it. It was a reminder that morality does not always announce itself loudly. Often, it exists quietly, in small, impossible choices, in pauses where the world demands instinctive cruelty, but the human heart whispers restraint. In his later years, Charlie often thought of his crew, the young men who had trusted him with their lives, who had laughed, cried, and prayed beside him in the cramped, rattling fuselage of that B-17 bomber. He thought about how fragile their survival had been, and how delicate the thread of life truly is in war. One wrong maneuver, One machine gun fired a second earlier, one failure to notice a flak burst, and it would all have ended differently. And yet, despite the chaos and danger, one man had chosen mercy. Franz Stigler's decision had saved them, and in that act, he had redefined courage. Franz himself lived quietly, often reflecting on what he had done. He never sought fame or recognition. He did not consider himself a hero. He did what he believed was right, and he carried that choice quietly, privately, through the remainder of his life. But he began to understand that some choices are larger than the individual, that sometimes acts of compassion ripple through time, far beyond the immediate consequences. One life saved becomes countless lives changed indirectly. Families survived. Children grew up. Generations were altered, all because of a single pause in the sky. When they appeared together publicly, they were careful to frame the story not as an act of heroism, but as a moral example. They stressed that the world is not divided neatly into good and evil, that people, even in war, are capable of choices that defy orders, ideology, and expectation. They emphasized that the story's power lies not in drama, but in humanity. Audiences listened in silence, often moved to tears, realizing that courage and mercy can exist in the most unimaginable circumstances. In private, both men reflected on their own mortality. They knew that history will eventually forget faces, dates, and even battles, but the choices themselves, the moral moments, endure. Charlie imagined the generations of people who might encounter their story long after they were gone. Children reading books, students in classrooms, soldiers contemplating the ethics of war. Each could confront the story and ask themselves the same question he had asked countless times in quiet reflection. What would I have done? Franz, too, thought about the meaning of legacy. Not medals, not accolades, not fame, but the knowledge that a single act of conscience can echo for decades, perhaps centuries. He wondered if others, observing the world's ongoing violence, might find his story a tiny spark of hope, a reminder that even when destruction seems inevitable, even when orders and systems demand cruelty, the human heart still has a capacity for mercy. Over the years, as their story spread worldwide, it became something more than history. It became philosophy. It became a meditation on morality, courage, and enduring power of human conscience. Veterans, students, civilians, and leaders all grapple with it in different ways. Some asked how they might apply it in their own lives. Others wondered if it was truly possible to act with moral courage when every system around you insists otherwise. The story prompted questions with no simple answers, questions that were meant to linger, to challenge, to force reflection. Charlie and Franz, in their quiet moments, often discussed these questions. They marveled at how a single decision, made in a fraction of a second, could transcend time, how the ripples of that decision could carry through decades of human experience. They spoke of the bomber crew, of the families that were spared grief, of the countless unknown consequences that stem from that one act of mercy. And they realized that, perhaps, this is the true measure of human action, not the immediate result, but the enduring impact of a decision guided by conscience. In the final years of their lives, both men embraced the quiet understanding that their story was no longer theirs alone. It belonged to anyone who encountered it. It belonged to people who would struggle with morality, who would face impossible choices, who would wrestle with fear and duty and conscience. It belonged to humanity itself. Charlie reflected often on the irony of survival. He had lived not because of skill, not because of luck, but because someone else had chosen life over death, mercy over destruction. This realization humbled him in ways no other experience had. It shaped how he approached his own life, how he treated others, how he measured courage and compassion. Franz, in turn, reflected on his own humanity. That single act of restraint had not removed him from the horrors of war, but it had preserved something essential, his moral integrity, the piece of his soul that could not be destroyed by orders or ideology. In choosing not to fire, he had saved not only lives, but the essence of what it means to be human. In the end, the story itself became eternal, not through records or documents, but through the moral questions it raised, the imaginations it touched, and the reflections it inspired. It exists now, suspended in every mind that considers it, alive in the silent spaces where choices are made. It challenges us to examine ourselves, our decisions, our courage, and our conscience. And so, the story does not truly end. It stretches across time, growing with every listener, reader, and thinker. It is alive in the pause between action and consequence, in the quiet recognition of humanity, even in moments of fear, violence, and uncertainty. It lives in every moral choice we face, every decision to act with integrity, and every instant when compassion triumphs over cruelty. Franz and Charlie are gone now, but the story persists. It whispers to us in spaces of conscience, asking the same question they live with day after day, year after year. What would you do if faced with the impossible? And the answer, as it always has been, lies in each of us. Because the story is infinite. It is the heartbeat of morality. It is the pause in the chaos. It is the quiet courage that persists long after the guns fall silent. It is human, and it will live as long as we are willing to confront it. It's easy to think of World War II as maps, flags, and explosions, big speeches, big battles. But this story doesn't start with any of that. It starts in the cold air, thousands of feet above Europe, with a badly damaged bomber, a young American pilot who thought he was about to die, and a German fighter pilot who had a choice to make. This really happened. And for decades, almost no one talked about it. December 20th, 1943, a freezing morning over Europe. The kind of cold that cuts through gloves and bones. On a U.S. airbase in England, a group of young men were climbing into a B-17 Flying Fortress bomber. Most of them were in their early 20s, some barely old enough to shave properly. They joked, they checked their gear, they tried to act normal. But inside, every single one of them knew the same truth. There was a very real chance they wouldn't come back. The bomber's name was Ye Old Pub. It was part of a massive American bombing mission over Nazi Germany. Their target was Bremen, a heavily defended industrial city. Anti-aircraft guns, fighter squadrons, one of the most dangerous places a bomber crew could fly over. The pilot was a young man named Charlie Brown. This was his first combat mission, not his second, not his 10th, his first. He had trained for this moment, but no amount of training prepares you for the real thing. Not for flak tearing the sky apart, not for watching other planes explode midair. As the formation crossed the coast and pushed deeper into Germany, the sky turned hostile. Black bursts of flak exploded around them, shaking the plane violently. Metal screamed. The bomber was hit again and again. The nose was damaged. The tail gun was knocked out. One engine failed. Then another. Inside the plane, chaos. One crew member was wounded badly. Another was bleeding. The oxygen system was damaged. At high altitude, that meant freezing cold and thin air. Frost formed inside the aircraft. Charlie Brown struggled to keep the bomber level, his hands numb, his face stiff from the cold and fear. Then it got worse. German fighter planes appeared. Fast, aggressive, deadly. They attacked the American formation like wolves. One bomber after another went down. Explosions. Fireballs, parachutes that sometimes didn't open. Charlie Brown watched helplessly as planes he had taken off would simply vanish from the sky. The Old Pub was falling behind. In bomber warfare, that was a death sentence. Separated from the group, damaged, slow, barely holding altitude, Charlie Brown's plane was now an easy target. German fighters swarmed around it, firing cannon shells and machine guns. The bomber shook violently. More damage, more injuries. At one point, Charlie Brown was certain this was it. This was how it ended, over enemy territory, on his very first mission. Then, suddenly, the firing stopped. A single German fighter plane pulled up alongside the bomber. Inside that fighter was a man named Franz Stigler. Franz was not a rookie. He was a Luftwaffe ace, a veteran pilot. He had flown many missions. He had lost friends. He had seen death up close. He believed in defending his country, but he also lived by a code taught to him by an older commander earlier in the war. You fight with honor, his commander had told him. If I ever see you shoot a man in a parachute, I will shoot you myself. As Franz approached the American bomber, he expected to finish it off quickly. One more victory. One more enemy aircraft destroyed. But when he got close, what he saw made him hesitate. The bomber was wrecked. The tail gun was silent. Holes covered the fuselage. One engine was barely turning. He could see inside the aircraft. He could see wounded men. One of them was trying to help another who was slumped and bleeding. This wasn't a fight anymore. This was an execution. Franz pulled closer, so close that Charlie Brown could see the pilot's face. He saw the German insignia on the plane. He saw the cockpit canopy. He thought, this is it. He's lining up the shot. But the shot never came. Instead, the German fighter flew alongside them. For a moment, time seemed to slow down. Two enemy pilots, eye to eye, suspended in the cold sky. Charlie Brown didn't understand what was happening. He was waiting for the bullets, waiting for the explosion. Franz looked at the bomber again. He knew that if he fired, no one would question it. The Americans were deep inside Germany. The plane was barely flying. Destroying it would be easy. It would be celebrated. But he couldn't do it. He later said that shooting that bomber would have been like shooting men in parachutes. Defenseless, already beaten. So Franz made a decision that could have cost him his life. He motioned with his hand. He tried to signal Charlie Brown. He pointed away from Germany, toward the North Sea, toward safety. Charlie Brown was confused. He thought it might be a trick. He didn't know what the German pilot wanted. He shook his head. He tried to keep the bomber flying. Franz flew closer and made the gesture again, this time more urgently. He was trying to help them escape German airspace. He even positioned his fighter so that German anti-aircraft gunners on the ground would hesitate to fire, thinking the bomber was under escort. For several minutes, the German fighter escorted the American bomber, an enemy plane protecting an enemy crew. Inside the old pub, the crew watched in disbelief. No one fired. No one moved. They didn't trust what they were seeing, but they didn't want to provoke him either. Eventually, as they reached the edge of German-controlled airspace, Franz pulled away. Before leaving, he saluted. Then he turned his plane and disappeared. Charlie Brown flew the damaged bomber all the way back to England. Barely. The landing was rough. The plane was so damaged that it was later scrapped. But the crew survived. Every single one of them. During the war, Charlie Brown told no one about what had happened. Not officially. He was afraid. Afraid that if he spoke about it, the German pilot might be hunted down and punished. Afraid that his own commanders might not understand. So the story stayed quiet. Years passed. The war ended. Franz Stigler survived the war too. He eventually left Germany and moved to Canada. He became a businessman. He lived a normal life. But he never forgot that bomber. He never forgot the faces of the men inside it. He wondered if they had survived. He wondered if he had made the right choice. Charlie Brown also carried a memory with him. For decades, he thought about that German pilot, about the moment when death had been right there, and then wasn't. In the late 1980s, more than 40 years later, Charlie Brown decided he had to try to find him. He started writing letters. He spoke at veteran events. He told the story publicly for the first time. He said he was looking for a German fighter pilot who had spared his crew during World War II. For a long time, nothing happened. Then one day, a letter came.